Okay, so before I start RAD techniques, do you guys have any questions about the requirements lifecycle management techniques or the elicitation and collaboration techniques? Either one. Okay, so let's get moving on RAD techniques because there are a lot of them. So this is a 65 slide deck. So RAD techniques, you have documentation and modeling. Under documentation, you have things like user stories and cases. Mind maps is actually kind of a modeling technique, and then you have your R&R matrices. Modeling techniques, structure, behavior, decision. Behavior is activity diagrams and state diagrams. So we'll talk about all of these. User stories. I would expect most of you are familiar with what a user story is. It's very, very brief. It's usually only a sentence or two, and it's specific from the perspective of a specific type of user, a specific role of user. And so it's all about a specific business objective. It does help us in prioritizing, estimating, and planning from a high level. It's a really great place to start. User stories usually have a title. Again, you're going to have a lot of them, so it needs to be easily recognizable with a very short statement. And then you have your statement of value. Now, the statement of value is usually in a very conversational, it's very conversational in its presentation with some acceptance criteria. And the conversational approach to that statement of value is as a, I need to so that I can. Something similar to that. Your acceptance criteria are often lists of constraints under which it needs to operate, or if, when, then statements. If this happens, when that happens, then this should happen. Some things like that. So it has a very specific structure that is expected of it. The strengths of it is that it's really easy to understand and communicate about. That's why I actually have my users write their own user stories, not acceptance criteria, but their user stories. I mean, if they want to take a stab at acceptance criteria, by all means. And it focuses specifically on a specific stakeholder's value and shared understanding. It's really quick to deliver, really quick to give feedback. Now the limitations can be, it can be challenging. Detailed specs aren't available up front. Now when you're using user stories, you don't expect those to be available up front, right? But when you start to dig into them, user stories will work for simple change, but don't necessarily work for complex change. So we need to be willing to perform the additional analysis necessary, and we need to be willing and flexible to allow the opportunity for additional artifacts to be developed. For example, screen mockups, use cases, activity diagrams, things like that. And if you're in a highly regulated organization or environment, if you're in a highly regulated vertical, sometimes those regulators don't like this approach because they aren't great at the necessary level of detail to ensure compliance and to control risk. So that's something that you would want to keep in mind if you are engaging in the use of user stories. One of the things that I like to say is we need to let Agile be Agile and allow the business analyst who has the expertise and understanding of the business to know what kind of documentation is most appropriate to support and enable the change, and let them do that. And as a business analyst, I will sometimes do just a user story with acceptance criteria. Most of the change I get involved in, I don't know if you guys know about the Life commercial, but it's the bunch of kids at a table and got a bowl of cereal and it's new and no one understands it. So, you know, the first kid's like, I'm not going to try that. And then he shoves it to the kid next to him. I'm not going to try that. They shove it to the kid next to him, and that kid's like, let's let Mikey try it. He eats everything. Well, I'm Mikey. I get the things that are not understood by people or are too complicated for others, and no one wants to deal with it, and I'm always willing to take a stab. So what my work very seldom stops at a user story with acceptance criteria. My work usually needs a lot more from me. Mind mapping. How many of you, by a show of unmuting yourself, have used mind mapping before? Not many of you. Okay, Mind mapping is so fun. And it's a really neat way to get people engaged. When I use mind mapping, even if I have people that don't want to get along, or they're uncomfortable with the process of business analysis, they will actually engage with mind mapping. Mind mapping is a very creative way of capturing ideas and putting it in a non-linear structure. So it's, again, the word creative. It really helps people think outside of the box, and it makes it so that people realize and communicate things that they may otherwise not have done. So it's a really great way. And I use color. Like you see on this, I use lots of color on mine. You group your ideas as topics and subtopics, and then these can have further lines out. And it uses words, and you can use pictures and color and stuff like that. Let me show you one. So that's crazy. Don't look at that. That's going to scare you. So if you look at creativity, what productive is it? Here's a tool that you can use. How you can use creativity. Let's see, what's a better one there? Let's see, time management. What is that? Oh goodness, no. Wow, this one's crazy. User experience. This must be user experience. Milestones, service experience, statement of being. This is a good time management one. Clarity, effectiveness, tools. How do you get there faster? Delegation, things like that. So it's actually you see how creative some people get. How to focus in the age of distraction. Help for addicts. Take a digital technology detox. How do you do that? Say yes to creating, spending time with family, reading a book. Say no to TV, Facebook, mobile. See, so, and what you do is you start with the central idea, and someone says, well, get away from technology. Okay, so to do technology detox, what should you do? Okay, here, and then you start saying, well, what shouldn't you do? And then you just start blowing out all of this stuff. So mind mapping is really creative, it's really fun, and people really engage. Again, very collaborative. Gets people talking, gets people creating and thinking and stuff like that. Helps you take a really difficult idea and break it down into manageable chunks and pieces, and it gets people thinking creatively. You come up with solutions that you may very likely not have thought of otherwise. So I'm definitely a mind mapping fan. The team and I have had a lot of fun using it for defining CRM and helping figure out culture and all kinds of really cool, neat stuff. The limitations are, I don't know if it can be misused as a brainstorming tool. I don't think using it as a brainstorming tool is a misuse, personally, because I think it's an amazing way to brainstorm how to break down a complex idea. And if you're not careful with those complex ideas and you get too detailed, it can become overwhelming. I think a couple of the examples we looked at were overwhelming. And it also can be difficult, and this isn't listed in the limitation, if you don't know how to do a mind map and you're just going about it chaotically, you can actually cause more confusion than solving of problems. Use cases and scenarios. I am an advocate of use cases. This is where you actually can explain user experience. If you were to stop at user stories, but you're trying to design a brand new solution, it's hard to take those. Acceptance criteria, those individual acceptance criteria, and break them down into understandable user experience, because there's no way, you have all of these user stories where, as a claims representative, I need to see the medical data so that I can make a decision. As a claims representative, I need to have an interface that allows me to record the data for blah, blah, blah. Now, those two relate, as well as like probably 20 other user stories, but how? Right? How do those relate? Because those individual user stories are considered pieces in a use case, and I'll show you an example of what I mean in a little bit. So use cases really help you understand and explain how a goal is achieved. So every user story is what's called a scenario. It's one way to do that thing, and when you put a use case together, you put all of those scenarios in one place and you show how they all interact together and how collectively they result in the overall experience of the user. So use cases in when you're trying to describe something that's more complex than just a few lines, use cases are very, very useful in doing so. Then you can take all of your use cases and show how they fit together in a diagram. And this gives you the scope of the actual solution that you're building. Your scope is this whole thing, right? This is the scope of the solution you're building from a use case perspective, from a user experience perspective. You'll have your actors, you'll have all of the use cases in there, and you'll see how they, you'll see how they interact together. What actor works with what use cases, which use cases are included in other use cases, and which ones extend out to other use cases. You're going to talk more about use cases. For those of you that are going CCBA and CBAP, you will get a lot more detail in the use case understanding so that you can take your test in 2 weekends from now. I will cover this in more depth with you. Those of you that are doing the ECBA, really all you need to understand is what a use case is useful for. What are the elements of a use case, and what does a use case diagram look like? Use case descriptions, again, you should have a lot of them, have a unique name. There should be a goal that you're trying to accomplish with this case, who is involved in this case, what causes the case to kick off, what are the flow of events, and flow is not something you get in your acceptance criteria. That is something specific and unique that the use case gives you. And then it shows you what is your primary success flow and what are the alternate flows that can happen. So that gives the developer the understanding of, you know, when you see the if then when and if then when and if then when, this actually shows you how all of those connect and what causes what to kick off. So it's extremely useful. It's very, very valuable. And then you have exception flows. Honestly, they're exception flows and alternate flows in the use case world are usually the same thing, unless you're talking about true exception flows are honestly done in a QA process, not necessarily in the BA process. That's when a user behaves other than expected, and that's usually a negative path and is usually something that a QA person does. And then you also typically, if you're doing best practices, you communicate in this, what do I expect to happen when post conditions are usually, there can be multiple, and usually you understand what the post condition is for each flow, each primary and each alternate flow, and then you will have at least one thing that is guaranteed to occur at the end of a use case. For example, if I was to use managing claims as an example, I would say that my primary flow would be that the claims representative approves the claim. An alternate flow would be that they deny the claim. Another alternate flow would be that they send the claim for underwriting because it's complex. Another alternate flow would be that the dollar amount exceeds their allowed capacity for approval and it has to go to a higher level manager. So all of those are post conditions. But the guarantee is that the claim will be processed. Okay, so that's a use case. The strengths of this is it gives you that connective understanding of how requirements fit together, and it tells the true story. It's so weird. A user story is a single case of use, whereas a use case is a combination of all kinds of ways that you could use a screen, so it tells the whole story. I really think they're backwards on the naming conventions, but because of the fact that you show how the user would experience this, people connect to it easier. From a holistic perspective, a user story is easier to understand from a constrained, from a singular perspective, from a singular viewpoint perspective, whereas the use case makes the whole experience of the user more understandable. And therefore, your developers are more equipped to design a truly long-term successful solution. okay? Because it articulates the functional behavior, the user experience is described much more readily. Limitations are it's not supposed to be granular. You are supposed to still have differentiated requirements like the data elements and the rules by which it gets processed, and some of that detail should be in requirements that are referenced in a use case. So it's supposed to stay higher level. And unfortunately, there's not one way to write them. So if you get people that are familiar with one approach to writing a use case, they may not know how to read the use case approach that you are using. So that's something to keep in mind, and something to, now it all comes down to communication. I mean, if you communicate well, that won't be a problem. But if you don't communicate and you just deliver and expect them to just know how to read it, then you might have a challenge. Okay. Ugh, this is not my favorite technique. Business rules analysis. This represents operational knowledge. You're going to find this in all of your policies and things like that. Like you, in the United States, a customer must be of 18 years of age or greater to buy cigarettes, right? So that is a rule. It prescribes how we are able to make decisions or how things are calculated, things like that. It's very, very specific. You can accidentally misapply it, but you cannot violate it. Okay, so definitional rules are, so I'm sorry, I was giving you a behavioral rule example. You're not supposed to sell to someone if that's the case. A definitional rule will actually be controlled by a system. So if you have a system controlling whether or not, the system side of things, if I enter the birth date accurately of my customer, the system will not allow something to be rung up in the POS system. That is a definitional rule. That is a system definition rule. But I can't control the behavior of the user. So I provide that person guidance. I tell them that I give them the same rule. Now, they are supposed to ask for the ID of the individual, validate the birth date, enter the birth date correctly, and then not allow the sale. But the person can violate that rule. They can either ignore, and because most of those POS systems ask the cashier, does the person look over 27? And you could have someone say, yep, when they obviously do not. Or you could have the behavioral rule could be violated by the person saying, yeah, I see the birth date. I'm going to manually fudge that date because I want to be able to sell this product to this customer even though they're underage. So they can violate it, but it is a direct violation. Okay, so behavioral rules guide the action of people and can be violated by those people. Definitional rules are rules that are placed in a system that are data-driven and cannot be violated. You can accidentally set up the rule incorrectly and misapply it, but you can't violate the rule, if that makes sense. Strengths of business rules analysis is it helps us get an understanding of change quickly. If we have an enterprise-wide rules engine, it makes it a lot easier to implement change because our rules are right there, man. We've already worked on them. They've already been defined. I don't have to go dig it out of everybody. It's there. Most organizations don't have that. A centralized repository allows us to reuse those rules. So if we're talking about, we have some security rules because we are an insurance company and we have access to people's medical data all day long. Well, if that's the case, then I will be having some rules and I will centralize them, and every solution I implement that touches a claim or that touches medical data automatically consumes those rules from that centralized engine. The limitations are it can be a pain in the butt. It can be hard to get these rules. It can take time and they can contradict one another. When I worked at a secondary insurance organization, which is where those claims examples come from, they spent a year defining business rules before they ever started writing requirements. It was insane. And they still didn't have all of the business rules written well. So rules can They can take over your world. Roles and permissions matrices. This is where you document who can do what in a thing, right? Usually this is in the context of a system, but you can use this. This does come in the form of a RACI, like who's responsible for what. That's the roles. They can be a roles matrix. If you're talking about roles and permissions, it's usually CRUD. Based on the screen or the function in the system, you can either create, remove, update, or delete, right? So that's very technical. And the business analyst is the one that should define what roles can do which of those things in this system. Okay? The strengths of this is it helps us maintain the security, keeps us in balance. It helps you identify if you have some conflict of interest from a security perspective. It helps you ensure that everything is secured the way it should be. And if you do this well, it helps us understand transaction history, because if you have defined the roles and permissions well, and that is tracked typically in your solution, then what happens is you are able to have that visibility into who's done what, because it allows you to set up audit trails. And when you have it documented for activities in a specific endeavor, like change, if you have it documented for the roles that are engaged in change, it can help reduce frustration and confusion because everyone knows what's expected of them, right? Limitations are, again, like everything that we do, especially if you don't have a lot of experience with it, it can be time consuming, and it can be easy to miss some roles that I should be documenting. So it does take some skill. It does take some familiarity and awareness of what's involved with that in order to do it well. Okay. Concept modeling, and then I'll pause for just a moment and make sure you guys don't have any questions and make sure I haven't lost you, make sure that you're not reeling in all of the data that I'm shoving at you. So concept modeling. This is a way to take typically complex ideas and put them in a form that uses big business language that is understandable by everyone involved. So for example, I'm going to show you another example on here. One moment, please. Okay, I'm going to show you this core concept model because it's going to help put some context to it. If you are looking at the BABOK and if you are engaged in this process, you will recognize this. This is from the BABOK. It is straight out of the BABOK, right? This is a concept model. This shows, okay, in the world of change, we have these core concepts. We have the concept of change. Change is anything that is going to be different tomorrow. We have the concept of solutions. These are the things that are used to meet needs. We have the context within which the change occurs. That's typically like, what is the business area of an organization that is going to be experiencing the change? And you have the value that a solution delivers, and what does that mean, right? So now if I take it further to put it into a way that makes like natural language sense, we will see. Let me see if I can blow this up and not lose value. Okay, so changes. Changes are responses to contexts. Contexts contain solutions. Solutions are useful in contexts. Needs are implemented through change. Changes satisfy needs. Changes can cause need, right? Changes increase value for stakeholders. Stakeholders participate in change. Do you see how that works? How that core concept model shows you can use the language. You don't have to use these words. This is still a concept model. This helps you apply context to what that concept model means and helps it make sense as to what it's all about. That is probably one of the best examples of concept model that we have in our training opportunities. So I just wanted to, I deviated a little bit from the slide deck, but I think that that might help provide you more value than just trying to describe it. So it's not intended to be about data. It's not about data. You're not saying how these things change data. You're not trying to codify anything. It's simply noun and verb concepts in order to help explain the concept of something. So concept model is where we usually start in change, especially in strategy analysis. Very business friendly, short and sweet. It's easy for people to understand it. It's not doesn't get mired down into technical details, so it doesn't get as confusing. It's just a really easy way to consume the ideas. It reduces the ambiguity. It gets us on the same page. Now, you do have to be able to think abstractly. A lot of your technical people they're not comfortable working in the world of concept models because it's too abstract. It's not concrete enough. Accountants will often have that kind of a problem. Any role that is highly detailed in the data that it leverages can have difficulty in using concept models. If you want to ensure that it's used well, it's best to have a tool. Most of us don't have one. Most of us are just drawing with whatever we have access to. Any comments or questions so far before I cover the last half of this slide deck? Okay, let's go into data dictionaries. So we start with glossary and concept models. Those go together. Now we need to understand how does that relate to the data in our environment. So when we do data dictionaries, we have primitive elements and their meanings and allowable values. So that means first name, middle name, last name. Those are all, what do they mean? How do we relate to those? What are the allowable values? Well, with first name, middle name, last name, it's any text value that represents a name. You will want to understand how those combine into a composite data element. For example, first plus middle plus last equals full. So that's primitive and composite data elements. When you're documenting your primitive data elements, you'll want to give it a name. What is the name? So first name. What else might it be called? First, name, things like that, right? Just first or just name. What values does it allow? Text. If I'm talking about city, state, zip, city, what else might it be called? I mean, I guess you could call it, some places call cities townships, which is interesting. What are the values? Well, if I'm in the US, I will usually constrain the values available on city based on state. I'll only allow certain cities when I choose the state. What are the meanings of it? What are the meanings? What does the organization think it means? And a small description. Some other elements you'll have is you might want to know the type of data, like see right here. You might want to know what accuracy, is it unique, is it required, is it, all of those things are primitive data elements. And then you have the compositive, like I said, first plus middle plus last equals full, right? So that's where you will have it. And when you're creating composite data elements, you'll want to know, when I take the primitive ones, do they go in a specific order? Do any of the elements repeat? Is any element optional? In the situation of full name, the sequence would be first, then middle, then last. Nothing repeats, but middle name is optional. Okay, so that's an example. The strengths of data dictionaries is it helps us stay consistent on the format and content of the data we're working with. And what does all of that data mean? It helps us consistently use data in our environment. The limitations are it has to be maintained. If you try to use data dictionaries that are not kept up to date, then you're going to risk failure of a solution. And the other limitation, honestly, is that data dictionaries, you have to know a little bit about, this isn't a listed limitation, but you you need to be able to be just a little bit technical, right? You need to understand what are data types, how are they used, things like that. Data modeling. So I've got my glossary and the concept model together, right? I've converted that into a more granular listing of data dictionary, data elements. Now I need to show how all of that data works together, how it all relates to one another. So data modeling is how I take all of those individual entities or classes or data objects or whatever and show how they relate to other entities, classes, or data objects, show how that fits in the whole domain and what are their attributes, what kind of relationships do they have with each other. An example would be an ER diagram. A lot of people call it ERD. That's Entity Relationship Diagram. And then the other thing is class diagram. Okay, so when we think about those, we'll have multiple levels, and I'll show you in a moment. I'll show you an ERD in a moment. But at the really, really high level, you'll have the conceptual data model. That's a very similar idea to the concept model you just looked at, but it's specific to data, not just about organizational glossary terms. Okay, so it's not necessarily about the business language, it's specific to data. It's the data language, it's just at a really, really high level, showing how those data elements at a high level relate to each other. And then you'll break that down into a logic data model. A logical data model is where I live mostly. I'll take those data elements and I will do an ERD, but it's from a logical perspective. I do some normalization, right? So I say I have customer, and then in the customer, they have one first, one middle, one last name, right? But what if they have multiple addresses? I don't want to try to record address 12 city state zip, address 12 city state zip over and over and over in that customer record, right? I want to relate the customer record to multiple address entries in a separate table. So I will show that from a business perspective. Now this is another situation just like prototyping. Prototyping could get you in hot water with developers. ERD work, or logical data modeling, can get you in trouble with DBAs. But I've had a DBA get their hackles risen with me doing that. I explained to them that I only am trying to wrap my head around how the business sees their data, so I make sure I ask all the right questions so he doesn't have a lot of rework to do later. And please just give me a chance, just let me show you just one time. You know, I bet your mom asked you to try broccoli at least once. Just once. If you don't like it, I won't ask you to do it again. I would. But but he doesn't have to know that, because I know that when I do it the first time, he's going to love it, and he did. And then I don't do physical data models. That's the actual design of the database, and it takes into consideration things like performance and security and stuff like that. And that's really where I don't belong. That is a DBA that needs to do that. They're the ones that specialize in that. This is like when you guys asked me, should I be doing the technical documentation, and my response is no. This is why. It's not my expertise. If I design it wrong, we have a problem. I don't do this work. I will design how the business sees it. You, as the technical resource, will do this part. Now, the strengths of doing data modeling is it helps us ensure consistency in how we communicate and the vocabulary we use about our data and what it means to us from a business perspective. It helps us make sure that our logical design represents the business needs so that it can be converted into a physical model that will work long term. It also gives us a really consistent way to document data and the relationships they have to one another, because data, if we get the data wrong, our systems are pointless, right? We have to have good data. We have to have a good understanding about how that data relates so that we can represent it in ways that can facilitate good business decisions. The limitations are, if people don't have a background in IT, they're not going to understand it. I don't show my ERDs to business. If I do, it's a rare moment, and I don't just email it to them. If I'm going to have to share this with business, I do it in person. I explain the connections and I walk them through it. Usually I deliver this to my technical SMEs. The business, they just need to read the requirements, look at the screen mock-ups, look at how the data falls on the screen, make sure that they read my formulas if I'm trying to calculate something that's theirs. Other than that, I don't show this to business. And because a single stakeholder that you're trying to show it to, it won't make sense to them. So I control that and I don't let that be a limitation. Process modeling. I would expect most of you have seen process modeling. It's a graphical representation of things people do all day long. Ideally, you're using an actual model, and it's at multiple levels. There is this thing called process flow. That is not a process model. Models are three-dimensional, and that's where BPMN comes in. Can I see a show of people that unmute themselves? Tell me, are you familiar with BPMN? Okay, some of you. Those of you that are not, if you're asked to document a lot of business process, I highly recommend you look into BPMN. It is in large circles, like if you were to go to the International Conference for Business Analysts, there is an international conference, biggest one. It's the only official conference for business analysts and architects and people like that. And they talk about BPMN. If they talk about process modeling, they're talking about BPMN. So it would be really healthy for you to be aware of that. That allows you to do multiple levels. That allows you to abstract natively in the technique because it uses things like sub-processes and things like that in a specific notation that tells a story. I can deliver my business process model using BPMN, and I can tell a very complex story with very little hand-holding. So process models are different than flows. Flows keep going, keep going. They're like that Energizer bunny, and they go all across the wall, right? And if I tried to show that to an executive, remember what we talked about with executives in detail, that executive would check out. They have more important things to do than to try to understand every little tiny detail on your process model. So ideally what you do is you do three-dimensional. That allows you to share only the level of detail necessary for that specific person that you're trying to present to. Flowcharts are one-dimensional. They go across the page. BPMN is becoming the way to communicate process models. Okay, that's process. Activity diagrams are very different. Activity diagrams show the detailed activities people do to interact with a system or a process. Value streaming is a little bit more of an activity diagram. It's a combination of flow and activity diagram. It does show some deviation, but it's not. It's meant to evaluate a small section of process. If you try to get too big into the process, then if you try to get too big of a process, then value streaming becomes more onerous than valuable. So it's important to be aware of that. Value streaming is extremely helpful in identifying waste, and that is only identifiable at a much more granular approach to looking at things. So business process modeling, value streaming, they give you different things. So, and both are very valuable. Personally, I've worked in an environment where I had a continuous improvement team and a business analysis team that were separate. And the business analysts were able to leverage the continuous improvement team to get the detailed understanding about efficiency of a process. And we were able to leverage them to say, okay, what if we made this change? And that value stream individual, that continuous improvement person could say, if you switch that, the expectation is that the throughput time would reduce by this. So I could show percentage of efficiency savings by using the value streaming. It's really, really cool. Process models are usually pretty easy to understand, and if you're using the right versions of process modeling, you can show multiple levels. So you can give different viewpoints to different people. I can give the high level to the executives, and I can show all three levels, all layers to the people that are the doers. Because even though their primary focus is that lowest level of behavior understanding, they do want to understand how they fit into the big picture. Value streaming doesn't show a lot of scenarios. Flowcharts don't really show a lot of scenarios. Process modeling shows a lot of scenarios. The process modeling allows you to incorporate deviation and decision points in a way that you can show, okay, this or this can happen because of these reasons. True process modeling gives you that. And it's really, so one of the really cool things is when I do my strategy analysis and I have people that are like, oh boy, it's going to take forever. We're never going to get anything out of this. I finish my strategy analysis workshops. I send out my very first raw data. They're looking at that, absorbing that. By the time they've spent a little time with that, I'm sending them the process models. And every single time I get told, oh my God, we need to do those workshops for every functional area of our organization, because now we actually, for the first time ever, have a visual tool to help people understand what they do. Very often I get engaged where they've got policies and procedures written. Who reads all that text? But you put it in a process model and people are more likely to follow the process more effectively. So it's extremely valuable. That's where we come with reusability. So a strength, this right here, means this is really great for reusability. Limitations, it's perceived as document heavy. My tool makes it easy, so it doesn't take me very long. If you don't know what you're doing, it can be really difficult to manage. I have tried to consume some really painful processes, and I was probably staring at my wall for an hour drooling before I actually had something click in my brain and went, oh, I know how to make that look easy in a picture. It can be hard though. It can be really difficult. And most of the time, I wouldn't even say complex processes, but that's the limitation you need to know. Most of the time, you need multiple perspectives. You need to understand the upstream and the downstream as well as the current stream. So it's important to get those perspectives. And it doesn't show process problems. That happens in your conversations. That's where doing process modeling with them, with your resources, is very, very valuable. Data flow diagrams. Data flow diagrams are a way for us to show, we had the glossary, then we had the data dictionary, then we had the data diagrams. Now we can show how the data flows amongst all of those elements. So we show how the data flows, how it changes as it moves through the flow, and we can again do multiple layers of abstraction. So at a really high level, you see something like this. It's very, very similar to your context diagram, but now we're talking about data. Okay, so meaning your concept model. It's very similar to concept model, but now we're talking about data, so we call it a context diagram. And then we take that to level 1. So level 0 is context diagram. Level 1 is where we start showing actual data elements and the processes that change those data elements, right? This is where we show the system-related flow of the data. So I'll talk about how a customer submits a claim in the web portal, and then that sends the data over to the centralized repository for the claims management system, and the claims management system backend normalizes that data. And then I talk about how the claims person will review it and manage it and process it, and then they do their claims decisioning process that converts that claim into a finalized claim that's either approved or rejected. So things like that. We show that kind of stuff. We show where does the data come from, what's done to it, how does it change, what is the output data, and where is it stored. It shows all of those things. Now, usually business analysts will stop at this level. There is a level 2 and 3, but those are technical and should be done by technical resources. Most data flow diagrams look like this. This is the external entity is like the web form for the customer claim. That is submitted in, the claims process happens, and then it's stored in the database. Okay, so the external, where is the data coming from? What's the flow, and where is it ultimately stored, and what processes change the data? The strengths are it helps us uncover processes and how it relates to data that we may otherwise not find. It helps us to find the scope of the system and its interfaces. It's pretty easy to understand. I mean, you saw the layout. That was pretty straightforward. And it also helps us identify when we have replicated data that we shouldn't have, because replicated data increases the possibility of invalid data. Limitations, it can be difficult. The more complex the solution, the bigger the solution, the more complex this becomes to document. There are multiple ways you can document. Pick one so you don't have that limitation. And it doesn't help you understand the context of processes or people. So you need to do your business process while you're also doing your data flow. Okay. State modeling. This is really straightforward. This shows the life cycle of an entity. So you have a requirement that's open, it gets approved. Okay, it's approved, it's in progress of being developed. At any time I can cancel it. The user can say, nope, never mind, I don't need that. Once it's approved, it's in development. Okay, great, it's in development. At any given point we might learn something and cancel that requirement, or we implement it. At any given point I can also just put something on hold. Things that go on hold might eventually be implemented or might eventually get canceled. It's that straightforward. The data elements, there's the states are, this is all about a single data element, and the states are represented with those rectangles with rounded corners. The strengths, it helps us understand the rules, because usually it's business rules that cause the state to change. So it helps us identify the rules. It drives out those conversations if we haven't already had it. So rules can drive the state diagram, or rules can be uncovered by the state diagram. And it also causes us to talk about things that are done that cause that entity to change states. The limitations, everything takes time and effort. And getting consensus on a single state model, if you've got multiple people having influence on that data, can take time. And I believe this is our last task, sequence diagrams. We'll cover this more later. This is really not something that ECBA needs to understand. So since I'm the one that will teach you since I'm the one that's going to teach you your advanced techniques in 2 weeks, I'm going to really gloss over this, okay? Sequence diagrams, they're a very technical approach. This is one of the most technical things a business analyst will do, and I would actually argue that in my world, I get the technical people to do it. I don't do these. It shows how that information is passed between actual development objects. So this is the most technical thing that a business analyst might be asked to do. This is where we say, okay, when it leaves here to here, I need a message sent, it might get deleted. It shows what things happen and how these objects interact with a data element and how it might cause it to change. So this is a very technical version of your data flow diagram, because this is very specific to objects and messaging and things like that. Okay, so really what we need to understand at this moment, it is one of the most technical things. It shows how information is passed amongst technical objects during execution, and that messages are used between those and what it looks like. Okay, so that's the thing, and it moves left to right typically. Sometimes it'll return back, but the idea is that it moves left to right, just like a process model. Strengths is that it shows interaction between objects, visual and chronological, so it makes it easier for you to communicate to the developers. Use cases can be converted into sequence diagrams. So really what happens is you take a use case, this does not work with user stories. You could take a use case and you could say, this is what that looks like from the perspective of the technical objects, right? So you'll take the use case and you'll say the same way it moves through your use case, you'll show how that moves through the technical objects in a solution. Limitations. You don't want to do it for every use case. You probably only want to do it for really complex things. And it's usually used for modeling system flows. You don't want to get too technical with this, okay? Honestly, I would stick with data flow as opposed to system flow, as opposed to sequence diagrams, but that's just me. Okay, that is it for your techniques. I'm going to have to pass off the strategy techniques to Peter. So Peter will talk to you guys about my favorite knowledge area. So you guys are going to talk about SWOT, benchmarking. I do a lot of this work. And you will also talk about you'll talk about the decision analysis stuff, financial analysis, business cases. I do a lot of that. So you'll talk about that next week. Do you guys have any questions before I stop the recording and show you guys some stuff on use the requirements management tool and then set you free for the weekend? Is your brain mush and you can't even think of questions? I bet so. I'm sorry.